Hello from Pasadena Public Library. It's time for another story, and this is a story from the Middle East about Nasruddin the Hoja. Once, the Hoja borrowed a big cooking pot from his next-door neighbor. He wanted his wife to be able to cook up a big pot of things for a party that he and his wife were having. And at the end of a couple of days, his neighbor came back and said, "Well, are you finished with the pot?" And the Hoja said, "Could I keep it for another day? I think we still have need of it." The neighbor said, Of course. And at the end of the next day, the Hoja brought a little tiny cooking pot, only big enough to cook spices for a sauce. And he said to the neighbor, "You'll never guess. The pot had a baby. And here it is. I brought it away from its mother. It seemed ready to leave. I'll bring back the pot tomorrow." And the neighbor was surprised, and he thanked Hoja for the little baby pot, and he showed his wife and laughed, and they thought this was a very funny joke, perhaps a way for the Hoja to give them a present. The next day, the Hoja brought back the big pot. But a couple of weeks later, he asked to borrow it again. And they said, "Of course you can borrow it again. You took such wonderful care of it last time." And so the Hoja took the great big cooking pot again, and his wife again made food for them and their friends. But days passed, and he didn't bring the pot back to his neighbor. And finally the neighbor said, "Hoja, what about the cooking pot you borrowed?" And the Hoja said, "Oh, it was terrible. We did our best, but I'm afraid your cooking pot died." Died? How could a cooking pot die? What do you mean it died? And the Hoja said, "Well, it gave birth to a little baby, didn't it? If it was alive enough to have a baby, it was alive enough to die." And he left the neighbor standing there astonished, because that actually made sense, and he didn't know how to dispute it. But the Hoja never gave back the cooking pot. And so it was that the neighbor was left with a baby pot that somehow never grew up to be able to cook big things. And that was the story of the Hoja and the baby pot.